Imagine a court case in which the prosecution is arguing for John being guilty of murdering his wife Sandra. In this scenario, very specific evidence is required to establish John's guilt. However, the evidence put forth by the prosecution is merely aimed at establishing that John and Sandra are real people and that Sandra indeed has been murdered. Are they making a case for John's guilt? It's obvious that these things need to be true in order to even have this trial. It's no use asking who Sandra's murderer is when no murder has taken place to begin with. However, arguing for John being the murderer and arguing for John's existence and Sandra's murder being a real event are not the same thing. In the same way, arguing for the existence of a God and arguing for a specific religion being the result of divine revelation requires separate evidence. The existence of a God is indeed a prerequisite for a religion being his revelation, but proving the former does not prove the latter. For this reason, theistic apologetics could be divided into two categories: arguments for the existence of God and arguments for divine revelation through religion. I will refer to the first category as natural theology and the second category as religious apologetics. The first category may also include arguments for some sort of immanent deity, but it doesn't support a specific set of scriptures or a religious system. One can argue against religious apologetics in several effective ways. The first way is the irrelevant thesis approach. If we take the murder trial as an analogy, it's basically like asking, what murder? There's no reason to believe that the murder took place. Since religious apologists have failed to establish the existence of a God, asking whether a religion was the result of divine revelation becomes utterly irrelevant. The second way is to examine their so-called evidence. This means to analyze religious apologetic arguments and point out where and how they fail to prove what they aim to establish. This approach, however, is a quite tedious process. It's akin to tearing down a building with a pickaxe, starting on the roof, while the residents of the building are attempting to repair the damage. The third way is the even-if approach. This approach is to take your opponent's best possible hypothetical case. If even the best possible case the opposition can put forth can be established to fail, then their actual case fails by default. This approach cuts to the heart of the matter and focuses the debate on the most important issue. It's akin to planting dynamite in a building's foundation. So what conclusions can be drawn if we apply the even-if approach to religious apologetics? This will work for any religion, but Christianity will be used as the example. In order to examine their best possible case, let's imagine a world where religious apologists are far less limited than they actually are. Welcome to an alternative Earth, where Christian apologists still have access to the original biblical manuscripts, can demonstrate their date of composition beyond reasonable doubt, and have an abundance of historical and archaeological evidence for biblical events at their disposal. We will even make it easier by leaving other religions out of the equation. I think it's safe to assume that Christian apologists in the actual world really believe they have evidence for their religion. Otherwise, there wouldn't even be a reason to engage the non-believer in debate. Well, if that's the case, then what would Christian apologetics look like in this alternate reality? They would hardly have any opposition at all. Or would they? I think they would, and I think they should. But before we can consider what counter-apologetics looks like in this alternate reality, we need to define some terms. Obviously, we are human beings. The term God in this context refers to the monotheistic concept of a supernatural consciousness who is the foundation of reality and who brought everything external to himself into existence, either directly or indirectly. I will often refer to this being as the divine creator. However, in many supernatural worldviews, including Christianity, the supernatural realm includes other personal beings as well. We could refer to these beings as little g gods, but I will use the term often used in the Christian religion: angels. I need to stress that I'm not using the term angel as necessarily meaning a messenger between the creator and humans, but simply as a general term for easy reference. In other words, when I use the term angel, I'm referring to any concept of a supernatural personal being apart from the divine creator himself or human souls. This means that God and angels are both supernatural personal beings, but God is not an angel and an angel is not God. Not only are both types of beings supernatural, they are also superhuman. The term superhuman refers to any personal being who lacks human limitations and whose abilities exceed that of humans. God and angels are superhuman, but being superhuman doesn't require one to be supernatural. An example of natural superhumans would be an advanced alien race from elsewhere in the universe, or transdimensional beings who occupy either different or more spatial dimensions than humans. A similar example would be a Matrix-like scenario in which humans exist in a computer simulation, meaning that we have limitations that the designers of this digital world do not have, as they exist in their own material realm with its own set of physical laws and restrictions. If time travel is possible, then we have yet another example of people who, although human, have far greater technological capabilities than we have. I will use the term aliens as a collective term for these natural superhumans for ease of use. So remember that some aliens might actually be considered humans in a biological sense, but are either from the future or outside of our realm. So to summarize, God, the divine creator, is the supernatural, superhuman and personal foundation of reality. An angel is any supernatural superhuman apart from God or human souls. And an alien is any kind of natural superhuman. With these definitions, let's return to our hypothetical world. And let's consider some possible interpretations of the Bible and biblical events. In other words, let's consider 4 groups with different views on the cause behind and nature of biblical events and content. Christians believe that the Bible is a revelation from the divine creator, who caused the biblical events, sometimes using angels, sometimes acting directly. The biblical character Yahweh is the divine creator. Spiritualists believe that biblical events and certain features of the Bible were the result of angelic activity. This group consists of certain subgroups. Some of them believe in the existence of a divine creator, but not that he was involved in biblical events. Some believe that the Bible merely is a human interpretation of angelic encounters, while others believe angels actively inspired the writing of the Bible. The biblical character Yahweh is therefore either falsely described as the divine creator on purpose, or is misidentified as such. Alienists believe that biblical events and certain features of the Bible were the result of alien activity. This group consists of certain subgroups. Some of them believe in the supernatural, but not that supernatural agents were involved in biblical events. Some of them believe that aliens came from another planet in this universe, others believe they are transdimensional, others believe they are from the future, and others believe that we live in a computer simulation under the control of alien designers influencing certain events. These subgroups are also divided over the role of human beings in the composition of the Bible. Some believe the aliens actively took part in the composition of the Bible, and others believe that the Bible is merely a human interpretation of alien encounters. And the 4th group are the skeptics. They believe that the evidence is not yet clear as to what caused biblical events and certain aspects of the Bible to be what they are. Even though these are broad categories, not every possible position is included in these categories, but let's imagine what it would be like for a skeptic to debate apologists from the other 3 categories. Remember that Christian apologists in this alternate reality don't have many of the limitations they have in the actual world. In this alternate reality, there is little question that many of the biblical events indeed did occur and the original manuscripts still exist. We also need to take into account that Christian apologists in the actual world believe they can make a strong case for the truth of their worldview, even though they have far more limitations than their alternate versions. So how strong is the case for the Christian worldview in this alternate reality? If the biblical events indeed took place, if Jesus performed wondrous acts and was seen alive after the crucifixion, etc., how could a skeptic respond to their argumentation? The Bible is often referred to as the Word of God, but even if Christianity were true, all biblical claims are actually made by the prophets. They are the ones making claims about Yahweh. We do not have the ability to address Yahweh himself and get a response. It's the belief that Yahweh was speaking through the prophets that's in question. The difference between Christianity being true or false is the nature and identity of the source of the knowledge of these prophets. What were their claims based on? Did they indeed serve as the mouthpiece of the divine creator as a revelation to mankind, or did something else happen to them? Who is this Yahweh really? Is he truly the divine creator? Is he a made-up character? Or is he a quite different entity altogether? We also need to realize that anyone can make any claim about himself or about someone else. Simply making a claim proves nothing. I can claim that I designed the Empire State Building. That doesn't make it true. I can claim that my father designed the Empire State Building. That doesn't make it true. Thousands of people could claim that my father designed the Empire State Building without it being true. Claims require evidence. The Bible itself is not evidence, but a collection of claims that require evidence. However, Christian apologists insist that the Bible does contain evidence for the identity of Yahweh and divine revelation through the prophets, namely through miracles, scientific foreknowledge, historically accurate information, and prophecies. But the problem should be apparent. In this alternate reality, not only Christian apologists could use these arguments to support their position, so could spiritualist apologists and alienist apologists. How can any of these arguments be used to establish that Yahweh is the divine creator, rather than an angel, an alien, or that the prophets falsely attributed these things to the creator when they were actually not caused by the creator at all? Let's take a closer look at these arguments and see what minimal conclusions we can draw from them. The Bible contains many events claimed to have been caused by the power of God. For example, the parting of the Red Sea, the healing of sick people, raining fire from the sky, people ascending into the sky, and resurrecting the dead. Let's say we could actually witness these events ourselves. What would we actually experience? If we would have been among the Israelites escaping from Egypt, we would see how the waters of the Red Sea would suddenly move apart and then close again after we made our way through. It would go against our experience of how water usually acts. If we witnessed Jesus healing people, we would see their symptoms disappear after he laid hands upon them. If we would witness Elijah winning his bet against the priests of Baal, we would see some sort of fire suddenly falling down from the sky, burning the sacrifice on which water was poured after Elijah made his plea to Yahweh. If we witnessed the ascension of Jesus, we would see him float upwards until he could no longer be seen. If we witnessed the crucifixion and the resurrection, we would see someone who by medical standards would be dead, and then 3 days later we would see him alive again, with some of his wounds still intact. Even if we witnessed these events ourselves, which none of us actually have, would we be able to determine the cause of these events? Or would we just have people's claims, including our own interpretations? We may very well come to the conclusion that the cause of these events must be superhuman, but could we go any further than that? Would we be able to determine what kind of superhuman caused these events? Would this superhuman have to be the creator of the universe, eternal, the most powerful being possible, the most knowledgeable being possible, or even supernatural? Christian apologists would not be able to derive a single uniquely divine attribute from these events. Even spiritualists would not be able to determine that the cause was supernatural, as the various groups of alienists could invoke alien abilities. In fact, given our current technology, we could expect that we ourselves could cause similar events within a few hundred years. And just imagine what we could do with quantum technology, influencing things on the atomic or even subatomic level. None of these events actually require the supernatural, but even if they did, why would such a supernatural cause also have to be the creator of the universe? Why would it have to be the most powerful being and the most knowledgeable being? Even in the Bible itself, angels can cure and cause disease, for example, and are shown to have abilities far succeeding human abilities. Some Christian apologists claim that the Bible contains scientific foreknowledge that couldn't possibly have been known if the Bible was solely a human product. However, even in our hypothetical alternate reality, it's still the case that this so-called scientific foreknowledge is based on very questionable interpretation of specific verses. I do not accept for a moment that the Bible contains a modern scientific understanding of the world. Nevertheless, even if the Bible contains scientific foreknowledge, it is highly unimpressive to say the least. I don't believe that the Bible accurately describes the shape of the earth, but even if it did, Aristophanes was able to figure it out himself a relatively short time after the biblical claim was made, and he didn't even have to use technology. I don't believe the Bible accurately describes that the moon reflects the light of the sun, but even if it did, Pythagoras was able to figure it out without modern technology. I don't believe that the Bible accurately describes how the earth relates to the rest of the solar system, but even if it did, there already were heliocentric models among the Greeks as well. Even ignoring that, a simple telescope like Galileo used can hardly be called impressive technology to begin with. I don't believe that the Bible shows any medical knowledge that could not have been known at that time. But even if it did, it doesn't show any medical knowledge that we haven't found out already. Moreover, the Bible never states why one should wash his hands after touching a dead body, or why the life is in the blood, for example. Even if the Bible does contain scientific foreknowledge, it certainly isn't anything impressive. Are these things that only the divine, eternal creator of the universe, who is the most knowledgeable being possible, could know? Of course not. Even if we take the claims of scientific foreknowledge seriously, the spiritualists and the alienists could use the same arguments for their own position. In fact, if we ourselves developed advanced space travel and went to a planet with beings far less advanced than us, even our children could provide the level of scientific knowledge that is presented in the Bible. In other words, even if lower forms of superhumans like aliens or angels were behind the information in the Bible, they certainly weren't trying to impress us. Invoking omniscience to explain this level of understanding is downright absurd. Just like the supposed scientific foreknowledge in the Bible isn't very impressive, the Bible merely reports a very limited history of a very limited area. I don't believe that the Bible really is historically accurate, but even if it was, it wouldn't take impressive superhuman abilities to reach this result. To put this in perspective, let's consider the alienist who believe that we live in a computer simulation. If we live in a world designed by aliens, then every detail of our world is either the direct result of this alien design, or would at very least be part of their database. Those aliens would be in the position to describe history in the most extreme detail. They could report what happened on any location at any point in time. The Bible's history doesn't even remotely compare to that. The same could be said about interdimensional beings, time travelers, aliens from another planet with thousands of years more advanced technology than us. And natural explanations aside, do even Christians believe that the angels couldn't know about human history? And this is all assuming historical reports that go into the most extreme detail, which are not actually found in the Bible to begin with. The best Christian apologists can come up with is how a certain king or a certain city is mentioned. And of course, in reality, there is historical evidence against the Bible as well. But it should be clear, even if the Bible was completely historically accurate and went in far greater detail, it still wouldn't tell us anything more than that the source of this knowledge is some sort of superhuman, but none of it requires that this superhuman is God. One would say that the best possible argument a Christian apologist could use would be the argument from prophecies. However, this of course assumes that only God can know the future and no one else. It also assumes that the prophecies in the Bible require knowledge of the future, which they don't. The biblical prophecies which supposedly provide us with a specific date require highly questionable calculations filled with assumptions that are not supported by the text itself. For example, that a prophetic year is 360 days or that a prophetic day represents a year of 360 days. It also usually involves taking verses out of context. But regardless, how is this an argument that could only be used by a Christian apologist and not by a spiritualist apologist or an alienist apologist? Moreover, even among Christians there is no consensus regarding divine foreknowledge. Apologists on the Reformed side believe that God's foreknowledge is based on Him causing the future to be what it is, and open theists believe that even God cannot know the future. Claiming that God does know the future or that only God can know the future is impossible to prove. In the Matrix example, the alien designers outside of the simulation could certainly tell what would happen later on in the program, and one can only speculate about the knowledge of angels. And when it comes to influencing events to turn out a certain way, all kinds of alien and angelic abilities could be invoked as well. You don't actually need to know the future to predict an outcome if you have sufficient influence. Religious apologists might object to the various types of superhumans proposed by other apologists by asserting that those apologists have to make up some sort of intent for why any of those superhumans chose to interact with human beings, which for some of the subgroups even includes intentional deception. The problem is that religious apologists do not have knowledge regarding the divine creator's intent either. First of all, their assertions regarding divine intent are based on scripture itself or perhaps on natural theological arguments. I will deal with natural theology later on. This means that they are referring to Yahweh's intents whom they believe to be the creator. It's not the case that they have any knowledge regarding the creator's intents. Instead, they merely believe that Yahweh is the divine creator and we can know his intents through scripture. Apart from the myriad of problems to even determine Yahweh's intentions in a reliable way through scripture, these writings do not actually provide us with Yahweh's intents. They provide us with the beliefs of the prophets regarding Yahweh's intents and the fact that they believed him to be the creator. This belief and the belief that the prophets were inspired by the creator is precisely what's in question here. The fact that we merely have assertions regarding Yahweh's intents is the main problem for all three types of apologists. All of them can merely speculate as to why their proposed type of superhumans chose to interact with humans in this fashion. Nevertheless, the alien apologists are in a far better position, even though they can only rely on speculation as well. The reason for this is that their speculation is based on things humans could do with increased technology. We already experiment with lower life forms for our own benefits and even with other humans, which sometimes even includes purposefully giving those subjects false beliefs in some circumstances. Matrix-like computer simulations are in the end a matter of simply not being currently feasible. The same applies to visiting other planets. This type of technology already exists in a primitive and limited state. When it comes to angels or the creator, we have no basis for any speculation regarding their intents, much less if such beings even would have any intent, desires or goals. In the end, it is the religious apologists who assert that Yahweh's behavior in the Bible is something that the most powerful, most knowledgeable, eternal, supernatural foundation of reality would do if such an entity exists. And some apologists insist that we can appeal to philosophical arguments to determine that this is the case. So what about natural theology? The religious apologists may assert that these types of arguments can help to not only establish that a divine creator exists, but that a certain type of divine creator exists. In other words, an immanent creator, rather than a purely transcendent deistic creator. First of all, I obviously reject the validity of any natural theological arguments. I have a refutation of most of these arguments on my channel. All of these arguments are horrendously fallacious and often cannot even establish what they attempt to establish. Secondly, I also reject that these arguments, even if valid and sound, can help us to determine either the identity of Yahweh or the intents of the divine creator. Moreover, getting from some form of immanent deity to a god who would establish a specific religion is quite a stretch, to put it mildly. And even if God had some sort of provisions and purposes for creatures, it doesn't follow that we are those creatures. Let's take a look at the most widely used natural theological arguments and analyze what kind of entity they would establish if they actually were somehow valid and sound. Even if the Kalam argument was a valid and sound argument, would it only be compatible with a religious worldview? Even if we grant that there is a divine creator who serves as the foundation for contingent entities, it still doesn't tell us what place our universe has within reality. It's compatible with the view that the creator merely created the angelic realm and that the angels then proceeded to create the physical realm. In fact, this sort of concept is actually found in some religions. It's also compatible with the view that either the creator or the angels created a physical realm, but any kind of alien, whether transdimensional or living on a certain planet, then created another physical realm or a matrix-like computer simulation. We can basically let our imaginations roam free at this point, because the Kalam argument doesn't tell us anything about what the creator directly created or why, merely that there is some form of supernatural cause. The same applies to the argument from fine-tuning. Even if our universe was fine-tuned because of some sort of design, it doesn't follow that the creator did this fine-tuning. Spiritualist apologists could just as well claim that angels were responsible for the fine-tuning after God made his creation. In fact, there have been religions with similar views, like Gnosticism. Moreover, even if divine or angelic fine-tuning took place, it doesn't follow that our universe was fine-tuned by those beings. A matrix simulation existing within such a fine-tuned physical realm would itself also be fine-tuned by naturalistic superhumans. Even if you want to claim that the creator did the fine-tuning, it's also possible that he chose to create a universe in which the physical laws constantly change but remain steady for 1 trillion years. In such an immensely old universe, life would be the inevitable outcome for some of those eras, even though this universe wasn't specifically designed for life. In one of those eras, a matrix could be built which is our universe. Of course, these are all completely made up and hypothetical scenarios, only to demonstrate that natural theology leaves us with mere speculation. These arguments are compatible with all kinds of worldviews. And we could not come to the conclusion that a specific one is correct based on these arguments alone. The more argument doesn't even lead us to a creator to begin with, nor does the transcendental argument or the ontological argument. Even if these arguments were valid and sound, they could not help us determine what place humans have within the larger scope of things, or what our relation is to either natural or supernatural superhumans. Religious experience also cannot help us determine the identity of Yahweh. Whether Yahweh is the divine creator or some other type of superhuman does not change what the prophets or any other human would experience. In fact, mere personal experience cannot tell us the nature of what we experience to begin with. Mere experience tells you what a rock feels like and looks like, but it doesn't tell you its constituents. Merely seeing or even feeling lightning and surviving doesn't tell you what lightning consists of, what processes are involved, and what causes lightning. In the same way, witnessing a prophet performing a miracle, or Jesus returning from the dead, or a voice speaking to you in your head, is not sufficient to determine the nature or cause of these experiences. The best possible result for a religious apologist is to rule out very specific examples of superhumans, but that would still leave countless of other possible identities for Yahweh. Young Earth creationism could, for example, rule out specific types of aliens, but not all of them, and it does nothing against angelic claims. Presuppositionalism would at best show that God is required as the foundation of logic and reasoning, but it doesn't show that Yahweh and God are the same being, rather than Yahweh simply being a superhuman who also needs God to rely on for logic and reasoning. The supposed witness of the Holy Spirit, or the presuppositionalist claim of divine certainty, could just as well be misidentified certainty from any other type of superhuman. Even if it could be determined that the Creator made certain provisions for creatures, it simply doesn't follow that we are the recipients of those provisions. After all, it would be physically possible for those recipients to then create and or interact with other life forms, just like we interact with other life forms. Whether it be angels creating a physical universe, or computer designers making a matrix simulation, or aliens performing experiments on beings from other planets, or whatever, even if the Creator is concerned with some kind of creatures, it doesn't have to be the case that we are those creatures. No matter what the religious apologist appeals to, whether it be religious apologetics or natural theology, they will still find opposition from various types of spiritualist apologists or alienist apologists. Natural theology doesn't actually provide us with many of the uniquely divine attributes ascribed to the Creator in Christian theology. But even in as far as it could somehow point towards a God who interacts in whatever way with creatures, it is an absurd stretch of logic to use this to support a specific religion in which God performs very, very specific actions.
Everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe had a cause. So it logically follows that the cause is obviously the all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good, spaceless, timeless, uncaused, transcendent, personal deity who chose the ancient Jewish desert dwellers to write down his message on scrolls and then eventually reveal himself to the rest of us by doing things like turning water into wine, while in the form of his own son, an ancient Jewish carpenter who was eventually sacrificed so that he could forgive you for not living up to standards that are impossible for you to live up to.
Great. Now I don't even fucking believe in me.
However, we must certainly not forget the most important group here, the group that all of these apologists should worry about. A group who will point out the most essential problem that all these apologists inevitably run into. Let's look through the eyes of a skeptic. Speculation, assertions, possibilities. Is this what constitutes evidence for one's worldview? Let's think back to the courtroom and the murder trial. A murder was committed. The husband of the victim is accused of committing this crime. What evidence is put forth? The husband is physically capable of committing murder. The husband has access to the location where the victim was found. It's at least conceivable that the husband could want to murder his wife. The prosecution cannot think of a better alternative. The husband exists. The defense cannot prove that the husband is innocent. At least some of the other suspects are probably innocent. Is this evidence? Could we convict a man based on these types of arguments? No. It may be true that it was possible for the husband to kill his wife. It might even be somewhat expected of him. But that's not evidence of his guilt. The prosecution is not making a case for the possibility of the husband being the killer. It's about whether or not he actually killed her. The possibility of John being the killer is merely a prerequisite for the claim that he is guilty. In the same way, a skeptic might be willing to agree that some sort of superhuman activity is necessary to explain biblical events. But what do the apologists have to offer? Is it really any different than the prosecution in this courtroom analogy? Anyone can assert that any kind of superhuman was responsible for whatever biblical event. But without actual data of the source and demonstrable explanations regarding the processes that were involved in these events, we are not dealing with evidence. At best we could conclude that a specific type of superhuman is more likely than another. Perhaps the husband is to some extent a more likely culprit than the other proposed suspects. But is that sufficient to conclude that he really is the killer? It is in the end irrelevant whether it was possible for God, angels or aliens to be behind biblical events. It's about whether they truly are. If I could witness the resurrection of Jesus, I might indeed conclude that I witnessed some sort of superhuman activity. I also regard the existence of biological life on other planets to be very likely. I would readily grant that it is possible that aliens caused this event. But if an alienist apologist would come to me and claim that the resurrection was caused by extraterrestrial activity, I would demand to see actual evidence for that claim. I would concede that it's a possible explanation. It might even be my preferred hypothesis to look into, but without actual data, without actual demonstrable evidence, it still remains nothing but mere speculation. It's an educated guess at best. My keys are not in my pocket. Perhaps my girlfriend took them. That is certainly possible. Maybe she even did that before. But even that doesn't mean that it is true this time. Occam's razor is of no help to Christian apologists either. The existence of angels is already part of their worldview, and given their belief that the universe is designed for life, alien life would be highly probable. Moreover, Occam's razor is of a tremendous disservice to the Christian apologist, as no biblical event requires any specific divine ability. Not even natural theological arguments lead us to a complete Christian God concept. The amount of assumptions Christians need to make to go from the existence of a divine creator to their specific religion being a divine revelation is absolutely staggering. We also need to understand that Occam's razor is not a rescuing device for one's worldview. It neither does nor is meant to prove anything about the world. Even if Occam's razor would somehow favor divine revelation over alternative causes, that doesn't establish it as being true. Not to mention that throughout history, divine activity and other supernatural activity has been attributed to all kinds of phenomena, and any objector could have appealed to Occam's razor to favor God being the cause over some new undiscovered principle or entities. Before we knew of germs, and if you believed in God and angels and demons, you could appeal to existing entities to explain disease rather than to appeal to an entire new category of organisms. But evidence of germs was discovered. That's how we gain new knowledge. Occam's razor is most useful to show how a specific hypothesis requires additional and more specific evidence. We know of at least one realm of existence, and the mere possibility of an additional realm is only warranted if such a realm actually explains something that a single realm cannot. So we can appeal to Occam's razor to limit our worldview to a single realm, but in the end that's nothing more than simply stating that we are not going to believe in an additional realm when the need for such a realm has not been demonstrated. Evidence is required, not speculation. It's not merely the case that religious apologists have no actual evidence for their worldview. All of these apologists have the same problem because the very form of argumentation they use could at best only show that their proposed explanation is a possible explanation or at least more likely than some of the alternatives. And this is in the end the best case scenario for the religious apologists. So now let's return to the actual world, in which religious apologists cannot even get close to the best case scenario of the alternate world. So is there any reason for a skeptic to take religious apologists seriously for even a second? The reason that spiritualist apologists and alienist apologists are very rare in the actual world is because it cannot even be determined that any kind of superhuman activity is required to explain any religion. There is no need for a creator, there is no need for angels, and not even a need for aliens. Religious apologists cannot even take the very first steps towards their goal. Probably the most important question in desperate need of an answer regarding religious apologetics is why it exists in the first place. It may be the case that the religious require apologetics for personal growth and as a form of loyalty, but that's not how skeptics encounter apologetics and not the type of apologetics we are discussing here. In debates between atheists and theists, apologetics is used in an attempt to demonstrate theism as being true, in order to convince skeptics and to defend theism as a rational worldview. Of course, close to no apologist will claim that the actual act of salvation is the result of apologetics, but it is the way to prepare the mental soil, if you will, and to break down intellectual barriers. The irony here is that for both salvation as for preparing the road towards this destination, even the most intelligent and well-read apologist is ill-equipped compared to God himself. Apologetics as a tool for convincing skeptics of the intellectual merits of a theistic worldview cannot and should not have to be used by God's fallible and limited followers. Remember that we're not dealing with deism here, where God's involvement is not in any way expected. When we are dealing with religious apologetics, we are not merely dealing with a God-fearing human agent who merely wishes to express his loyalty and devotion, a dog barking when his master is attacked, so to say. The skeptic's view is attacked as well, and supposedly there is a God who wishes some form of relationship with that skeptic, although this type of relationship differs from one religious interpretation to another. Nevertheless, what it comes down to is the following. Either God wants people to know about his existence and will, or he doesn't. If he doesn't want people to know about his existence and will, apologetics is meaningless to begin with. If God himself doesn't care, there is no reason to take an apologist seriously. If God does want his existence and will to be known, then he is either able to demonstrate this or not. If God is unable to demonstrate his existence and will, then apologetics is meaningless, because if even God cannot demonstrate his existence and will, fallible apologists literally have no chance. If he can demonstrate his existence and will, he either is better at apologetics than his human followers, as good as, or worse. I don't think any religious apologist would claim that they are as good as or better than an omniscient God. So if apologists want to claim that God is either unwilling or unable to demonstrate his existence and will, apologetics is meaningless. And if they want to claim that God is willing and able, then apologetics is still meaningless as far as them being the agents to argue with the skeptics. Again, we are not talking about the perceived duties and loyalty of the religious followers, but about apologetic arguments specifically aimed at convincing the skeptic of the truth of a specific religion. Some apologists would in fact grant that it's not their job to convince skeptics, which is fine, but this gives skeptics every reason to dismiss them out of hand, as they themselves admit that it's between the skeptic and God. Some apologists may insist that convincing people of God's existence isn't the goal, since a mere recognition of God's existence is not what religion is about. After all, even the demons believe that God exists. However, this objection fails, as knowing that God exists is still a prerequisite for any kind of relationship between God and a human being. You are not going to argue for the identity of a murderer if you are not aware of any murder having taken place to begin with. Some apologists may insist that not all people can be convinced of God's existence, or that there is a category of people who can be convinced of God's existence but would still never follow him. However, this is simply a mixture of the two categories depicted here. The first one applies to people who can be convinced, and the second one to people who cannot be convinced. Also, if so many people cannot believe in God, then one should wonder why belief is highly valued by God. Moreover, what exactly is the difference between humans who cannot be convinced and humans who can, as there has to be some cause for that distinction. Whether we have free will or not is irrelevant. Even if those reasons are emotional, I don't think any apologist would claim that those reasons are reasonable. If people make the wrong decision by rejecting God, then wouldn't God know exactly how to dissolve those barriers? And if God is okay with people freely choosing to reject them, then what is the problem to begin with? The apologist would then admit that rejecting God is the right decision for at least some people, in which case apologetics is obviously meaningless. No matter how you take it, the greatest irony in the religious apologetic endeavor is that religious apologists will inevitably claim that there must be a good reason as to why God himself is not actively involved in apologetics or isn't aiding human apologists with divine knowledge to remove intellectual barriers, misunderstandings and objections. However, whatever reasons they come up with, it will always be an assertion that is based on and defended by their own unaided apologetic argumentation. For example, they may claim that life is a test and therefore humans need to gain a knowledge of God without divine assistance. But how did they know that? It's an assertion based on and defended by apologetics without divine assistance. The irony here is that this doesn't mean life is just a test, it's already a test to find out that life is a test. They may claim that it's a violation of free will if God made his existence too obvious. Not only is this merely an assertion based on and defended by unaided apologetics without divine assistance, it is actually falsified by their own scriptures. The unbelievers in the Bible itself are not atheists, and the angels obviously believe that God exists and are often depicted as being in direct communication with him. Yet some of them reject God's will nevertheless and become demons as a result. They may claim that free will is in the end still the reason why apologetic arguments are rejected, regardless of whether it comes from God or an unaided human. Again, this suffers from the same flaw, but it also fails to take into account that such a rejection is not arbitrary, but has some underlying reasons. Wouldn't God know exactly why those people reject him, and wouldn't he know exactly how to explain to them why those reasons are flawed? Whether or not free will exists is in the end irrelevant, as such freedom doesn't imply that people make choices without reason. They may claim that evidence is not required, as the witness of the Holy Spirit, whatever that may be, is sufficient to know that Christianity is true, but evidence is merely a way to show that Christianity is true. Therefore, apologists provide skeptics with arguments in order that the Spirit may use those to bring that person to himself. Not only is this a direct contradiction, as the apologist just admitted that the Spirit doesn't require arguments to get the job done, but even as an aid, the Holy Spirit himself would be better at providing arguments than any human apologist. And if they claim that everyone already knows that God exists, and apologetics is merely meant to convict the rebels, then they have made their religion directly falsifiable for any unbeliever, since only they can test whether there really is a universal knowledge of Yahweh. Such a religious view can therefore directly be dismissed as necessarily false. In the end, religious apologists are forced to desperately attempt to rationalize their very practice in the face of countless conceivable scenarios in which God may not exist, does not care, or has some unknowable reason that perhaps, just perhaps, justifies how their debate with skeptics makes any sense at all. Religious apologetics is a joke without punchline. It is a way to pretend that a factually wrong worldview has a rational basis rooted in evidence, when many of the famous apologists themselves admit that their faith isn't ultimately founded in arguments. Nevertheless, it is expected of the unbeliever to accept the validity of a religion because of such arguments. With all the guessing and speculation found in religious apologetics, allow me to make an educated guess myself. Apologetics isn't meant for the skeptic, it is not aimed at them, nor is it designed to bridge some gap between them and a deity. It is a scam, a pretense, an illusion aimed at the believers who are in doubt. It is not meant to persuade unbelievers, but to prevent believers from becoming unbelievers. There is in the end no difference between evidential apologetics and presuppositionalism. All apologists start with the conclusion that God exists and that their particular religion is true, and then they try to rationalize it after they already committed their lives to that religion. When believers are in doubt over the seemingly inexhaustive amount of problems which are inherent to a religious worldview, they turn to the apologists to ease their conscience. The Bible and other religious texts are defended to death because they need to be guarded from criticism. That's because these texts do not have a divine source. They don't even have an angelic or alien source. These texts were written by people who had a far more limited understanding of the world than we do, just like our understanding of the world will pale in comparison to the generations of the next few millennia. The Bible looks exactly what one would expect if it were written by primitive people without any superhuman influence. Even if the Bible had an alien source, no human author would be able to rival it. And that's not even what the religious believe. In their worldview, even advanced aliens or even the angels from heaven could not remotely compare to the Almighty Creator's infinite understanding. Yet these primitive texts are all we got. Stop trying to make excuses for why it is this way. Stop trying to make divine inspiration the default position, just because the text itself makes that claim. If I performed a wondrous act you couldn't explain and claimed that I was eternal and the foundation of all existence in human form, would the mere act of doing something beyond your understanding be sufficient for a claim that requires so much more? And that's in the end how apologists will be perceived by skeptics. Not as rational or as great thinkers, but as pitiful. The fact that there are so many highly intelligent apologists out there doesn't speak in religion's favor. It makes it even sadder. If they were ignorant, they might have had an excuse, but they should know better, and you should know better. But it isn't about knowing better, isn't it? When you watch a video like this, your conclusion that your religion is true is already your starting point, which makes any criticism wrong by default. Then it simply becomes a matter of identifying something, anything that you can pick out to make yet another asinine pretense of a refutation. It doesn't matter if the objection has already been dealt with in the video. It doesn't matter if the answer to your objection is clearly implied in the video. As long as it hasn't been mentioned literally, you can pretend to make a point, and more often than not, pretend that a small insignificant detail can refute an entire video. Because it's not about trying to understand the criticism and think it through for yourselves, now is it? You will dismiss these kind of videos because the inevitable, arrogant and irrational conclusion is already firmly engraved in your mind. Your religion is true and therefore all criticism is wrong by default. You hold on to your religion because you want it to be true. And you want it to be true for all the wrong reasons. As long as you try to defend the factual wrongness of a religious worldview, the skeptics will be there to tear down the illusion. And once you are ready to face reality, you will find yourself among them.